The Sculptor of the Damned and the Peculiar Clock by L. Frost. Narrated by Kyle Kilchrist. "27. Why do you think the sun comes up every morning?" Silas asked. He sat atop his familiar lofty perch as the red morning sun crested the distant hills and sharp rooftops. It slunk between thick tendrils of fog, like a thief slipping past merrymakers at a dinner party, though its light had yet to provide the warmth that it promised. The mist swirled and danced with the rays of light, but the cloudy canopy below refused to part, obscuring the ground that hid below, sequestered beneath the weathered shingles and smoking chimneys that pierced the covering. "What?" Thaddeus grumbled. Silas glanced at his companion, who also sat on one of the stone pillars. The column was blackened from age, a bit green in places where the mold had become as permanent as the stone itself, and it was connected to the other pillars by a carved stone railing that outlined the balcony which jutted out from the highest chamber of the tower. A curling piece of wrought iron adorned the top of the railing, twisting endlessly as it guarded against a careless step too close to the edge and to the great drop that awaited just beyond. "I said," Silas repeated, "why do you think the sun comes up every morning?" Thaddeus didn't seem to hear him for a time. He simply stared out at the gray expanse, dark eyes nearly unblinking. But then his face began to contort in contemplation, his sharp eyebrows and pointed chin collapsing towards his overly large nose in growing frown. "I suppose it wouldn't rightly be cool morning if the sun didn't rise, would it?" A light breeze hurried past, and Silas breathed it in, the smells of the damp morning painting colors in his mind that mixed with the smell of the old ancient stones beneath him. "How do you mean?" Thaddeus shrugged. "The way I see it, morning is when the sun rises. So if the sun didn't rise, then it wouldn't be morning. It would just be a very long night." He idly rubbed his chin. "So, the sun must rise every morning, because the only mornings that can exist are the ones in which the sun does in fact rise." Silas let that thought scurry through his mind. "So you would say, then, that the sunrise is what causes the morning to come to existence, rather than saying that the morning is what causes the sun to rise?" "Yes, that is what I would say." "Then why," Silas asked, "does the sun rise at the same time every day, thus bringing morning with it?" Thaddeus continued to stare out towards the rooftops. "Why do you think that it rises at the same time every day?" Silas frowned. He looked out at the rising sun himself and idly drummed his fingers on the stone beneath him. "Why would you ask that question?" "Why not? You seem so certain, I just want to know why. It's obvious, isn't it?" Silas glanced behind him to where the massive clock face rested at the top of the clock tower where they sat. The two huge hands of the clock slowly crawled their way around the perfect circle, never slowing or speeding, and certainly never stopping, even if the movement of the short, thick hand was too slow to perceive well. Silas looked back at Thaddeus, who finally met his gaze. "The clock tracks time, and the morning comes every time the hour hand makes two full rotations." "But how?" Thaddeus asked. "Do you know that the hands of the clock always rotate at the same speed?" "Well," Silas said, "I've never seen the speed of the hands change." Thaddeus looked back at the clock face as well. His eyes narrowed. "Would you be able to tell if they did change speeds?" "Perhaps they changed slightly," Silas admitted after a moment. "There could be small, imperceptible changes that I don't notice, but, roughly speaking, they stay moving at essentially the same speed. So the sun must rise at essentially the same time every day." Are you suggesting, then, that the same time comes back around in a theoretical circle? That a time which once has passed may eventually return? And if so, then why would that time return at the conclusion of the hour hand's double circuit around the clock face? Silas absently rubbed his cheek as he turned to gaze back at the expanse of fog floating between him and the sun. If you ask me, Thaddeus continued, I think we're asking the entirely wrong questions. What should we be asking, then? Perhaps the obvious questions. For example, what is time? The clock behind them rang with a loud, mind-rattling tolling of bells. Silas dutifully rose and followed Thaddeus into the chamber that lay past the carved balcony archway. Inside the walls of the tower, great gears and cogs turned with a mechanical grinding and clicking sound, filling the room with the chatter and groaning of the great machine. Ladders rose to meet rafters higher up, and a large wooden work table sat near the edge of the room. Most importantly, however, were the two levers protruding from the wall on either side of the wooden door. Silas moved wordlessly to one of the levers. Thaddeus moved to the other, and they both stood, hands gripping the devices, waiting for the bells to stop. Silas frowned as he waited. What was time anyway? The answer seemed important given their rather unique set of circumstances. The bells overhead quieted, and Thaddeus nodded. In unison, they both pulled the wooden levers down until a snapping sound came from behind the wall. Then the levers rose back to their original positions on their own, ready to be pulled again at the conclusion of the next hour. And the hour after that. And every hour beyond. Silas realized, somewhat annoyedly, that he was watching the wooden door at the center of the room again. He frowned. For some reason, he always expected someone to come striding through that door every time he and Thaddeus pulled the levers. There was no basis for this expectation that he could think of, other than a distant hope that the person who left them the letter would one day return and explain it to them. Pulling the levers always made him think about the letter, which always made him think about the author of said letter. It was logical, really. He absently moved across the room to where the letter rested, still nailed to the wooden work table just as they had found it. He stopped and rested a hand on the parchment, his eyes darting over familiar words. Greetings. I would very much appreciate it if you would be so kind as to pull the two levers in this room in unison once the bells stop ringing at the close of each hour. It is rather important. You see, if you ever fail to pull these levers at the correct interval, time will stop. Best wishes. Silas frowned and cast a furtive glance back at the door. Maybe the answers were there, on the other side. Maybe the author of the letter was waiting there for them. Perhaps they were meant to open the door. His eyes lingered a moment, then he sighed and turned away to follow Thaddeus back onto the balcony. It was a silly thought. They weren't meant to go through the wooden door. They were meant to pull the levers. If they had been meant to go through the door, the letter would have asked them to do that instead. Logical. It was always important to stay logical. He could get himself into trouble if he ever forgot that. Quietly, he passed under the archway, back onto the balcony, and returned to his seat on the old stone pillar. 41. Maybe time is like water. Silas glanced at Thaddeus, hoping for some reaction, but Thaddeus's stony gaze remained unflinching, watching the distant horizon. Silas frowned and let his gaze wander thoughtfully towards the grey sky. Think about it. Water flows in whichever direction will cause the least resistance, but if all directions resist the water's flow, then the water will gather and sit in one spot. It will become stagnate. Thaddeus glanced at him as one eyebrow rose. Are you suggesting that time is a liquid? No, simply that it behaves in a similar manner. Take the stagnate water, for example. If you were to poke a hole in one of the barriers surrounding it, the water would flow until something patched the hole, right? I would assume. Well, What if the hole was actually a door that could be opened and closed on demand? You could create a dam so that you collected all the water you could ever want, then let it out little by little as you needed it. Thaddeus rubbed his chin, then crossed his arms. Are you saying that someone has dammed up the flow of time? Not recently. He gripped his legs, forgetting their surroundings as he let his thoughts flow. What if time has always been dammed up? What if all of time already exists and it's just sitting in a great pool waiting to be allowed to flow whenever we need it? You're referring to the levers now. Why not? The note clearly said that time would stop if we didn't pull the levers every hour. What if, when we pull the levers, we release an hour of time into the world? It flows out from this tower, saturates our existences, and gets used up. Then we pull the levers again and release another hour of time. Perhaps if we held the levers down, all of existence would be allowed to pass by without any of us getting to experience it. We would experience it, Thaddeus said in a glum voice. A whole existence, in a moment. We would shrivel up and die in seconds, but we would experience it all in those few seconds. Would we even know it happened? Silas frowned. Would it make a difference to us if we experienced life in a matter of years or seconds? Would we even be able to tell, or would we see it all the same? I suppose there's no way of knowing. Given the option, though, I'd take years over seconds. Silas nodded, and Thaddeus went on. Still, though, that's only if your theory were even close to being correct, he grunted. Seems far-fetched to me. Silas sighed, deflating slightly, and rested his chin on his knees. Then what is time? Thaddeus's jaw worked silently, then he grunted. Maybe time is a series of pre-constructed moments. Silas frowned. Like paintings, Thaddeus continued. Time could be a series of paintings that, when put together, create the illusion of progression. You think that I'm a painting? Thaddeus squinted one eye. Have you ever seen an entertainer bring out several pieces of paper with drawings on them? He stacks them on top of one another, then flips through them with his thumb so that the images flash by so quickly it looks like a single image is moving, like a man running or something. I've seen it, Silas said. Time could be like that. We're made up of a bunch of still images passing by at such a fast rate that we think we're moving, but none of us are ourselves. Each moment brings a different me and a different you, and we're given the memories and emotions of the last iterations of ourselves. We move into and out of existence so rapidly that we don't have a moment to really tell if we're actually ourselves or not. Silas frowned. Not a reassuring thought, I must admit. Still, it was possible that each minuscule movement or thought was the sign that a new version of himself had been created to replace the old, only to immediately be replaced again? Thaddeus shrugged. I don't think many find much assurance when considering the nature or implications of time. If your theory was right, would that erase the notion of any meaningful ability to make decisions? Or any chance of making our own decisions at all? If we're merely a series of pre-created still images, then we don't have any chance at exerting our own will in any circumstance. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? The bells and the great clock behind them suddenly rang in a dissonant cacophony, numbing Silas's skull. Without a word, he lowered himself from his perch and followed Thaddeus past the archway and into the room beyond. He took his place at one of the levers and waited. The bells quieted. Thaddeus nodded, and they both pulled. A familiar snapping sound came from behind the wall. Then there was silence. Neither spoke, and they both moved quietly back to the balcony and retook their stony seats upon the ledge. 53. Silas watched a flock of birds move past in a rustle of feathers as he hummed and absently traced his stone perch with his thumb. He couldn't remember the words to the song he was humming, couldn't even remember what it was called. It was just a melody that had somehow wandered into his mind and would likely wander back out soon enough. Thaddeus sat on his perch as well, staring at the bustling city below. The people were like ants, small dots moving about with a purpose, but one that was impossible to determine from such a distance. Silas watched the birds descend and move to rest on the peaked roof of a stone building below. Some fluttered to the ground, likely in search of something to eat. Too far away to tell, though. "Where do you think we came from?" Silas asked, almost not expecting an answer or caring if it came or not. "In what sense?" "How many senses are there?" Thaddeus cleared his throat in a low grumble. "Well, I suspect we just came from our mothers, whoever they were. Less directly our fathers." He shrugged. "Just our bodies, though." "You believe we have spirits, then?" "Of course we have spirits." Thaddeus shrugged. "The real question is what a spirit is, not whether we have them. Or maybe we are them. That's a better way to phrase it." "Our bodies, then? They're just carriages for ourselves, not ourselves in actuality."
Of course."
"Of course," Silas frowned. "But then where did we come from?"
In what sense?
"In the sense of our spirits. If our parents created our carriages, then at what point did we enter them? When did we, as a spirit, begin to exist? And how? What are we, anyway?" Thaddeus grunted, then flicked a small piece of loose stone and watched it disappear towards the ground.
"Maybe we're a combination of our parents' spirits."
"Same as our bodies."
"Or maybe we're fragments of a god. Each one of us is a single aspect of some deity, placed inside bodies to separate us from one another."
"And yet so many of us hate each other."
An interesting observation."
Silas rubbed his head. "Might we have existed before we were born, then? Perhaps we just don't remember."
Perhaps.
Which leads me back to my original question. Where do you think we came from?
In what sense?
In reference to this tower." Thaddeus nodded.
Now, there's a useful question.
Silas waited, but Thaddeus didn't offer an answer, so he continued. "I don't remember anything before this tower. Do you?" Thaddeus was silent for a long moment.
"Not a thing,"
he finally said. "Exactly, so how did we get here? Where is here, anyway? Where is this tower? Who are those people down there?" Thaddeus squinted.
"A lot of questions for one day."
Silas nodded and looked back at the birds. They seemed to be content for the time being. "Do you think we were born here?"
"Do you remember being a child in this tower?"
"Well, no."
"Then perhaps not."
Silas laced his fingers together. "Does one have to be a child if they were born? Perhaps there are different kinds of birth."
"Perhaps, but who would have brought us into this world? Never seen anyone else here."
"Whoever left the note," Silas said excitedly. "Whoever is on the other side of that wooden door." Thaddeus turned in a sharp motion, eyebrows lowered.
"Bah! How do you know there's someone behind that door?"
Silas's mouth worked for a moment before he could speak. I don't know exactly, but surely there is someone there. The person who left the note." His eyebrows rose. "You've thought the same thing, haven't you?" Thaddeus's frown deepened and he turned away.
Bah, doesn't matter. We can't open the door, so why would we care what's behind it?
Silas nodded. You don't think we should open the door either? It wasn't a question, and it brought him some peace of mind to know that Thaddeus agreed with him. After a moment, Thaddeus laughed.
Ha ha! What a sorry lot we are.
Silas nodded, but they were interrupted by the crashing bells. His vision blurred at the raucous sound, and suddenly he found that he was seeing double. Still, he managed to descend from his perch and follow Thaddeus to prepare to pull the levers. 84. Rain streamed down Silas's face. A strong wind buffeted his shoulder, and thunder growled overhead, not far away, really. Sometimes the clouds seemed within reach, as if he could touch them if he tried. Lightning flashed, illuminating the nearly empty streets below. Not many people liked to wander about when it rained, though he wasn't sure why. Even the birds hid away somewhere out of sight. Silas glanced at Thaddeus, seated on his perch, then back towards the great clock face. The massive black hands crept their way around the circle, slowly, without any perceptible change in pace. Inevitable and predictable. Do you think we'll die here? Thaddeus didn't answer. Silas frowned and watched the minute hand drag itself around the clock's face. Slowly. So slowly. It slunk like a great shadow, eclipsing everything that rested behind it. The clock's hands were a specter, consuming each moment that they had touched, dragging the end of all things ever closer. Time was a dark, empty blanket, a funeral shroud. No moment could live beyond the instant it began to exist, because those hands kept crawling onward, a vile, hungry maw, insatiable and unavoidable. Everyone lived on the edge of a cliff, eternity on one side and an unending abyss on the other. Surely the dark hand of the clock would tip each of them into that abyss at some point, a matter of time. That was all that kept them hanging on to the edge. Silas realized that he had looked away from the clock, though he didn't remember doing so. He frowned. Well, do you think we'll die here? Thaddeus grunted.
Perhaps.
And then what? Silas glanced back at the terrible clock. What happens when we're gone?
In what sense?
What happens to time? Who will pull the levers?
Maybe we will.
Silas cocked his head. How so if we're dead?
Well, what is death?
Silas frowned. I suppose it is the absence of existence. Once time takes us. Thaddeus raised an eyebrow.
So you think that the life of our spirit is tied to the life of our bodies, our carriages?
Silas crossed his arms and stared over at the rainy city. Perhaps not, but then what happens to our spirits once our bodies have died? Thaddeus shrugged.
Maybe it's different for different people. Maybe you and I would be returned here. Maybe we've already died before, perhaps many times. You said yourself that maybe we've already existed, and we just don't remember it.
Silas let the idea roll around in his mind. So, we would be here. Forever. He surveyed the small balcony inside. I will admit, I might rather cease to exist than forever be stuck here.
Aye,
Thaddeus said.
But where is here?
Silas frowned. In what sense?
Where is this tower? Who are those people? You asked before, didn't you?
I did.
Well, did you come up with any answers?
Silas eyed him. I suspect that you did.
No answers. Only suspicions.
Which are? Thaddeus straightened, then met Silas's eyes.
What if we're already dead?
You've suggested that already.
But in a different way. He scratched his chin. I mean, what if this isn't the world as we know it?
Silas nodded, slowly. You're suggesting we're in some kind of afterlife?
Something like that. A kind of purgatory or hell. What if we did something wrong in our first lives and we've been cursed to stay in this balcony forever as punishment?
Thunder growled overhead and Silas shivered. It was a dark thought. I suppose there's an important distinction between purgatory and hell.
Aye,
Thaddeus said again.
but how do we tell the difference?
Maybe there is no difference, except that, eventually, we'll find that we can get out of this purgatory. If it's hell, then we never will.
The levers are a test, then?
A test, Silas agreed. If we are truly dead, and if this is truly the afterlife. Thaddeus shrugged.
It's only a guess. But at least it would give a partial explanation for that peculiar clock.
Silas's eyebrows rose. You find it strange as well? Thaddeus grunted and looked back at the clock face, and Silas followed. The black, wickedly curved numbers rested in their normal spots, the pitch-dark hands crawling at each one as they passed. Rain dripped from them like blood. Or maybe saliva, like that of a hungry dog.
Have you ever tried to watch it for long?
Thaddeus asked. I've tried.
Were you successful?
No, Silas answered, feeling strangely guilty, though why he couldn't say.
I've never been able to watch it for long either. There's something strange about it, I say. I start to get dizzy, confused, and then I forget why I cared to watch it at all, and turn away.
Silas nodded. I see a great void, an inescapable darkness, and I have to turn away. It fills my vision until all I see is nothing, and then I find that I'm looking at the city, or the birds, or asking you a question.
It's strange,
Thaddeus said.
no mistaking that. Quite strange indeed.
Silas frowned, then realized that he had turned away from the clock. Maybe stopping time wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. Thaddeus raised an eyebrow.
I thought the levers were a test.
Maybe they are, just not in the way that we thought. Perhaps hell and purgatory are the same place. The only difference is whether we go on pulling the levers for eternity or let them go.
That's an idea,
Thaddeus said.
but a dangerous one.
I suppose. The terrible bells split the air, and Silas felt as if hammers were crashing against his skull at the awful sound. Without speaking, he followed Thaddeus out of the rain and into the room with the levers. As he waited for the bells to stop crying out, however, he looked towards the simple wooden door. What was on the other side? Could he look? Just open it a crack and see what awaited them there. The bells began to quiet, and together they pulled the levers. Something in the wall snapped, and then there was silence. Silas sighed, then moved back towards his stone perch on the balcony. 103. Silas drummed his fingers on the weathered stone. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and the moon was covered by thick clouds, leaving them in darkness. Thaddeus sat silent as ever, watching the black horizon. There was no movement below, nothing to help pass the time. Only the still night air filled the darkness. If there is a hell and a purgatory, Silas said. Then there must be a heaven.
Perhaps,
Thaddeus said, sounding uninterested. What else would be the point of purgatory but to reach heaven? Thaddeus shrugged his big shoulders.
Who said there had to be a point to any of this?
Everything has a point, Silas said, frowning. In the end, I mean.
I doubt that.
Silas bit his lip. A small breeze brushed his face, and he breathed in deeply. Maybe you're right, but what is purgatory if not a path to heaven? Thaddeus shrugged again.
Free labour?
You think someone's using us?
Of course someone's using us.
The person behind the wooden door.
Who else?
Silas glanced back towards the room. But who is behind the door?
The person who left us the note.
Silas frowned. Do you think heaven is on the other side of that door? Thaddeus glanced at him, curiosity gleaming in his eyes.
What makes you ask that?
Silas shrugged. Heaven must be somewhere, if it exists at all. Who's to say that it's not on the other side of the door? Thaddeus frowned.
The person behind the door, then. You think that person is some kind of god?
I don't see why not. Who else would know how to keep time going? Thaddeus rubbed his chin.
Are you suggesting that we open the door, then?
Of course not! Silas cried, but then stopped. Why not? What harm could come from opening the door? To the side, Thaddeus nodded.
The letter said to pull the levers, not to open the door.
Exactly, Silas said, his voice sounding uncertain to his own ears. Unless, he added slowly, we consider the fact that the letter never mentions not opening the door.
Permission through lack of instruction.
Exactly.
A dangerous thought.
Silas rubbed his chin. Why was it so dangerous? What could possibly happen just by opening a silly wooden door? Then again, couldn't the same be said for the levers? What could happen if they stopped pulling the levers? Would time truly stop? Could something equally terrible happen by opening the door? Thaddeus cleared his throat and spoke again.
The way I see it, if this is purgatory, then we should accumulate good actions. Perhaps that will cleanse our souls. And seeing how the only selfless action we can take is pulling those levers, I would be hesitant to give up the job.
Silas frowned. But what if this isn't purgatory? What if this isn't the afterlife at all? What if we're wasting our real lives sitting up here in the tower day after day?
And what if we stop pulling those levers and allow time to stop for everyone else?
But it makes no sense, Silas said. If we had the power to stop time, why would someone just casually leave us a note and never check back on us? Never send us replacements? If we had really been given such power, then why did the person who left us the note never even talk to us to find out if we'd bother to do it at all? Thaddeus didn't answer, and Silas sighed. I just keep feeling like there's something important behind that door. Maybe it's the person who left the note. Maybe it's the rest of our lives, maybe it's nothing, but I can't shake the feeling there's something there.
Of course there's something there.
But what?
How should I know? One rarely builds a door that doesn't have something behind it.
Silas frowned. Then maybe it's about time we find out what's waiting there. Thaddeus laughed mirthlessly.
Whoa. I didn't say there would be anything interesting there. Probably just an empty room, as likely as not.
Silas shrugged. At least it would be a room away from this clock. As he spoke, he looked back at the massive, looming clock. It was so big. The perspective from where he sat made it seem that the clock was leaning forward, reaching towards him. Against the dark, starless night sky, the clock looked like a great beast. The black metal of numbers and hands looked dark, even against the abyss behind it. Shadows danced across the clock face, though from where or what Silas couldn't tell. dark shadows made of twisting, undulating shapes, shapes that bent in unnatural ways. As he stared at the shadows, he noticed for the first time that the hands of the clock had fingers. Lots of fingers, writhing about in all directions, writhing towards him. They reach further down, black tendrils of nothingness stretching to take him, to caress his cheek. Hundreds of them, all crying out, a cacophony of tiny, terrible voices calling his name. Silas. Silas. Almost without realizing, he stretched out his own hand, stretching towards the hands of the clock. His hand had fingers too. Maybe he was the same as the clock. Those beautiful, writhing fingers were nearly to his own now. He needed to reach it. The cries and screams filled his ears, filled his vision. The bells, the Silas! Silas realized he was watching the buildings far below. When had he turned away from the clock? The bells! Silas, come on! The bells were crashing together in terrible harmony, the laughter of a mad god, and Thaddeus was halfway to the room, yelling for Silas and wearing a terrified expression. Silas shook himself, then hurried to follow. He hustled to his lever, but his eyes fell on the floor. What was behind that door? He looked back towards the balcony in the night sky, and he started as his eyes caught twisting shapes moving about outside. They were vaguely humanoid, but unnatural, like the shadows on the clock face. Suddenly he remembered looking at the clock, remembered the fingers reaching towards him, and he shuddered. He had reached towards the fingers. What madness is this? He breathed. What? Thaddeus shouted over the horrible bells. I can't stay here, he said, the realization voicing itself on his tongue. The shadows outside twisted and danced. They seemed to beckon him to join them in their unholy revelry. They thrashed wildly, shouting like wild beasts, and the sight and sound of it made him wish he could bury himself in the earth. Where are we? He whispered, voice shaking. Silas! With a start, Silas realized the bells had stopped, and the last ringing was fading away. What are you doing, Silas? Pull the lever! Silas looked at his hand, which had a white-knuckled grip on the wooden lever. To the side, Thaddeus nodded and prepared to pull his own lever. No! Thaddeus pulled his lever down, and Silas released his grip, hand shaking. No snapping sound came from behind the wall. Thaddeus looked up, then his face filled with shock as he saw Silas's lever still upright. What are you doing? Pull the lever! No, Silas whispered, feeling like he was in some kind of dream. I'm not going to pull the lever. I'm going to open the door. No! Thaddeus screamed. He pulled his own lever again, then scrambled to Silas. He grabbed Silas's shoulders and threw him to the ground, then madly gripped the lever and pulled. No sound came from the wall. No! Thaddeus screamed. You've damned us all! Silas pushed himself up to his hands and knees. We're already damned if we stay here. We have to open the door. Thaddeus growled and spun towards Silas. You in that door? Why do you care about that door? I have to open it. It wasn't a good answer, but it was all that he could manage. He rose to his feet, then stepped towards the door. His hand trembled as he reached it towards the handle. What would he find? What would... Thaddeus growled, and before Silas realized what was happening, he found himself hitting the ground, Thaddeus's heavy body landing atop him as he shouted, You've damned me, Silas! Do you understand? Just let me see what's behind the door, he cried. No! It doesn't matter what's behind the door! It only matters that we pull the levers. And you've ruined it! Anger suddenly flared in Silas's chest, and he growled as well and shoved Thaddeus away. Thaddeus grunted and landed on his side, but he was quick to leap back towards Silas, teeth bared. Silas braced himself, then reached with clawed hands to grab one of Thaddeus's horns as they fell upon each other. Thaddeus beat his wings to try and wrench himself free, but Silas held on. He made as if to hold him there. Then, in a quick motion, he kicked Thaddeus in the chest, sending him sprawling to the floor. Silas scrambled towards the door. Thaddeus screamed, and Silas could hear him moving towards him. He had just to reach the door. It was so close. With a final shout of determination, he reached his hand up to grasp the handle. His fingers mere inches away. Archbishop Thomas ran his hands together as his eyes flicked over the morning's report. Bony, unsteady things. It wasn't long ago that his hands were firm, strong. Now he could barely hold a quill without them shaking like he was in a winter storm. Time was a great humbler of all men, it seemed. It hardly mattered how much one was respected or admired if he couldn't even pick up his own clothes to dress himself. What he wouldn't give for the body he had even 20 years ago. A quiet knocking sounded at his door. He frowned, but he set the paper down and cleared his throat.
Come in.
His voice sounded thin, weak, much like the rest of him, he supposed. The wooden door creaked open, and a thin, bony man stepped in. His sunken face was clean-shaven, cheekbones and chin jutting out behind pale skin, and his dark eyes seemed to imply intelligence, like those of a cat. He walked strangely, hands held behind his back, and his black hair was short and neatly kept. He was dressed in all black, and he wore an odd grin on a face whose age seemed impossible to guess. Thomas frowned.
I'm sorry, but can I help you? I don't seem to recall seeing you before.
Ah, the thin man said. My apologies. I am Onithir.
Onithir?
Thomas mused.
Can't say I've met anyone else with that name.
Alas, the thin man said in pretend despair. I am not from this beautiful country of yours. I am from a much colder place. As he spoke, Thomas noticed that the man held a strange, large pocket watch in his right hand. His thumb was absently caressing the intricately worked golden exterior.
I see,
Thomas said.
What is it then that brings you to my chambers?
Onithir bowed. Archbishop, I am the sculptor who is hired for the clock tower. Thomas breathed out in realization, but then stopped, eyebrows lowering.
Yes, I know who you are now. But surely you can't be finished already. You are free to come and go each morning and night without alerting me. I only need to know when the work is complete.
Onithir bowed lower still, if that were possible. Thomas certainly wouldn't have dared bend his back to dip so low as that. It seemed unlikely he would ever straighten it again should he try. Your Grace, I am finished.
Finished?
His frown deepened.
How is that so?
He pushed his chair back and rose.
You've only been at it for a day.
Onithir straightened, grinning as if to a private joke. Time is all relative, don't you think? What is time, anyway? He laughed and held up his hands. Don't look so scared, Archbishop. I am not trying to trick you into speaking some theological fallacy. No. Here. I'll tell you. What is time? Why, it is only exactly what we make out of it. He pulled back and smiled. And if I may be so bold, I believe you will be quite satisfied with what I have made out of my time here. Thomas frowned. He doubted that he would be very happy at all if the man only spent a day on the work.
I believe you,
he managed to say.
But for formality's sake, find Silas and have him inspect your work before you leave. He will see that you receive your wages. You've already met Silas, haven't you?
Onithir smiled politely. With respect, Archbishop, it seems as though Silas was unavailable to examine the work. Not properly, anyway.
Not properly? What does that mean?
It is a long story, I'm afraid. Thomas waved a hand towards the thin man.
Thaddeus, then. Do you know Thaddeus? You should if you were working on the tower.
Again, Onathir said in an apologetic tone. Thaddeus was unable to help me. I thought, given the circumstances, it might be best if you examined the work yourself. Thomas cringed at the idea. All those stairs. Onathir's smile seemed to grow sympathetic. I understand it is difficult for you. But don't you want to see the view from the top before you are unable to make the trek at all? Pardon my saying, but it's only going to get harder. I've found that it's best to take opportunities while we are still allowed them. Thomas felt his frown deepen. Who was this man to come and point out his failing body? But then, what was the use denying it? He was old, and he felt even older. It was true that he would likely soon be unable to make it up those stairs. He wasn't sure if he could even now. He eyed the strange man, then sighed and nodded.
I suppose you're right. There is little opportunity for excitement anymore. Perhaps climbing those steps is the best that remains for me.
The view is worth it, he said, stepping back to allow Thomas to lead. And hopefully my work will not disappoint either.
I hope the same.
The walk was tedious. Even crossing the courtyard from the church to the massive clock tower felt like an achievement. Halfway up the clock tower stairs, he realized that he had made a mistake. He was too old, too weak for this kind of exertion. But Onathir was there, urging him on, and somehow he managed to make it to the final step. Breathing as though he had run for miles, he braced himself with an arm against the wall and tried to will his heart to slow. Onathir swept towards a wooden door at the end of the room, moving in an awkwardly graceful kind of way. He held his arms out towards the door and beamed. Here it is, he said in a nearly gleeful tone. Thomas frowned, annoyed that he had let himself be talked into making this trip. Still, he expected that the view would be impressive, even if Onathir's work proved disappointing. With a sigh, he moved to the wooden door. He gripped the handle with a shaky hand and pulled, and the door swung open with a squeak. The room on the other side was filled with gears and rods and metal, all moving and clicking and grinding. Beyond the room, however, was a balcony overlooking the city. Feeling a small surge of excitement, Thomas moved through the room with the gears and stepped into the open air. Cold wind brushed his face, the sound of it joining the song of nearby birds. But his attention was on the expanse that lay before him. The morning sun was just peeking over the hills, the light of it just beginning to glint off the chimneys and rooftops below. The streets were quiet, but the first signs of life were already apparent. Soon they would be filled with life. But how different they seemed from up here. No smells, no shouting, only beauty. Magnificent, isn't it? Onathir asked from the side.
Yes,
Thomas breathed.
it's quite magnificent indeed. Thank you for getting me to see it.
Silence filled the air for a long moment, and Thomas drank in the beautiful view. After a time, though, Onathir broke the quiet. If I may ask, Archbishop, what do you think of my work? I'm eager for your opinion. Thomas glanced to the right, and for the first time he noticed a stone gargoyle seated upon a stone pillar. Its arm was extended as if reaching for something invisible just in front of it. It was one of the most impressive sculptures he had ever laid eyes on. The face alone displayed so much emotion, so much character. It looked almost as if it were truly alive.
Astounding,
He breathed. He turned and found that a similar gargoyle sat upon another stone pillar to his left. This one was also reaching towards some invisible object, but it appeared much angrier and perhaps older. Wrinkles played on its face and gave the creature a menacing appearance.
You did this in a day?
He found himself asking. Onathir pulled out his strange pocket watch and caressed it with his thumb. Again, Archbishop, time is hardly important. Only the result matters in the end.
Could you do more, then?
Onathir glanced up with only his eyes, and a strange smile played at the corners of his lips. I could, if that's what you desire. Thomas looked back at the first gargoyle, then the second. The man's work was truly amazing. They seemed so lifelike. He could almost imagine them turning and speaking to him. What would it look like to have these all over the tower? Along the railings? Along the sides?
Yes,
he said. Yes, I think you should create more. Many more. We'll put them all along the outside of the tower. We'll be sure to place some of them at ground level so that people can admire them more easily. Very well, then. I'll get to work immediately. Will you be coming down? Or will you stay up here a time? Thomas let his gaze wander back over the landscape below him.
I think it would be best if I let these old legs rest for a bit before trying those stairs again.
Onathir smiled and nodded. I thought as much. Stay as long as you like, but come down when you desire. Thomas frowned. Of course he would come down when he desired. He hardly needed this man's permission. Onathir laughed. Oh, forgive me. Oh, it has simply been my experience that people tend to think about what they want much more than they actually pursue it, even if it's right in front of them. Thomas nodded.
Mankind is a mystery, to be sure.
To be sure, Onathir echoed. Then his footsteps retreated back towards the door. The hinge squeaked again, but then the man's voice returned. Oh, Archbishop, I almost forgot. If you get a moment, I left you a note on the table. Would you mind reading it before you come back down? Only if you have the time, of course. Thomas glanced back, but the wooden door was already closed. Strange. Hadn't there been a man there? But of course he would have remembered if there had been someone else on the balcony with him. He turned back to the landscape for a time, but a nagging thought kept tickling his mind. He was here for a reason, wasn't he? But what was it? He turned and began pacing, but when he looked up, he noticed a piece of paper that had been nailed to the wooden table inside the room with the gears. Curious, he moved to the table and began to read the beautiful, flowing script. Greetings. I would very much appreciate it if you would be so kind as to pull the lever in this room once the bells stop ringing at the close of each hour. It is rather important, you see. If you ever fail to pull this lever at the correct interval, time will stop. Best wishes.